Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 13, Slavery and the Old South. Now, this is the first chapter in the book to take an in-depth look at the South specifically, and what exactly was going on in the South from 1800 to 1860, or pre-Civil War. What we're going to highlight for you in this video are the major differences between the North and South on a national level, as well as the changes that were more regionally North and South, meaning Upper versus Lower South. What you're really going to want to keep in mind is how did these differences contribute to a growing sense of Southern independence? Now, we've organized into a series of 3 questions and thesis statements that essentially are going to answer a one overview or chapter question and help to better understand not only the changes that separated the northern and southern regions, but also why these changes were taking place. So here's our overview.
What distinguished the South from the North? Contrary to the northern side of the country, the South was differentiated by an agriculturally dominant economy, exploitive slave labor force, and unique social culture.
The establishment of slavery throughout the southern side of the country was essentially what brought all major differences from the north. More appropriate for large-scale cash crop production, the majority of the southern landscape was owned by planters getting rich from the cotton boom, feeding the industrial progress in the north. Due to this major increase in cotton production, combined with the nearly pure profit of slave labor, the South created an entirely new culture of rich planters. This culture not only meant a society of minority planters controlling over 40% of the wealth, but also a society of harsh racial restrictions meant to exploit the human labor of African slaves for all that it was worth. Planters did not have the same manufacturing interests as their northern counterparts. Due to this, fewer than 1 in 10 Southerners lived in the city as compared to 1 in 3 Northerners. Also, because plantation production could only be profitable at the expense of large-scale industrialization, the South was typically opposed to Northern-style industrial growth, as they viewed every free worker a potential abolitionist. No more than 5% of the slaves in the South ever worked in manufacturing.
What factors contributed to the decline of slavery in the Upper South, and why did these not appear in the lower half? While the Lower South profited from the cotton boom, advantaged climate, and abundant numbers of slaves, the Upper Side, unable to farm the highly profitable crops of the Lower South, experienced an economic depression which caused an increase in northern influence as well as the shifts to crops better suited for the climate and geography.
Consisting of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, the Lower, or Deep South was, at the time, the most profitable region in the nation. Due to its near-perfect geography and weather conditions, cotton production flourished. In the states to the north, or Border South, including Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, conditions were much different, as the region lacked the fertile soil and long growing season necessary for full-scale cash crop production. Consequently, while the cotton boom animated the lower Southern economy, the upper portion experienced an economic depression until 1850. The emergence from this depression was a result of an increase in free labor, a northern development, as well as change from a single mass crop production to more efficient grain and livestock production by general farming. With this change came also the gradual acceptance of more industrial progress. By 1860, the Upper South was responsible for 3/4 of the entire South's manufacturing capital and nearly all of its heavy industry output. Adopting an economy more balanced among agriculture, manufacturing, and trade, the Upper South was becoming increasingly more like the North. This also meant the decline of slavery. As plantation agriculture gave way to more general farming in the Upper South, the region began to export its slave population to the Deep South. With this export, more tobacco farmers began to abandon the production, and with it their slaves, for the more modernly appropriate cheap and flexible free labor and general farming.
How did slavery restrict the rights of both free and enslaved black? The racist social and legal restrictions first introduced towards the enslaved blacks throughout the U.S. carried on with time and eventually applied to the increasing number of free blacks.
The laws of slavery, or slave codes, essentially limited the rights of all blacks, free or enslaved. These codes, made for enslaved blacks of the South, outlined the laws defining the status of slaves and the rights of masters. As slavery became a larger institution throughout the 19th century, and free blacks became increasingly more numerous, These codes began to emerge and apply to not only enslaved blacks, but free ones as well. Not directly translated, the codes or social and legal restrictions thereof began to become the racist tendencies towards blacks throughout the nation. The small 6% of free blacks in the South were then subject to what came to be called black codes. These codes were essentially the same as slave codes, but changed slightly to fit the free individual. Shutting out blacks from political processes and the right to court cases, these codes made the Bill of Rights completely obsolete. Ultimately, the racism that came along with the slave codes collectively came to be applied to blacks nationwide. After emancipation, these racist attitudes, first apparent with the creation of slave codes, would culminate themselves into the Jim Crow laws of the distant future. The moral pains of slavery would forever be installed in the black individual.
Though the majority of the whites in the South did not own slaves, what made the institution beneficial to the South as a whole?
The crude realities and the lack of morality that came along with slavery were overshadowed by the imposing grace and grandeur of the economic profits for the entire South, slaveholding and non.
Though non-slaveholding whites composed about 75% of all Southern families, and planters composed only 4% of the Southern population, the economic prosperity of the few at the hands of the Southern slave exploit was enough to obscure the realities of slavery as a whole. In fact, in the deeper South, owning slaves had become the only socially acceptable and safe way to gain profit and rise to the slaveholding planter elite class of society. Essentially, slavery had so deeply rooted itself into the culture of the South that a lack of slaves would, quote unquote, ruin a man's chance to marry in reputation. Not only has slavery become a necessary part of Southern society, but it also simply made the Southern population more accustomed to less hard labor. Slaves eliminated the need for a Southern man to work hard on land himself, and eventually the owner became accustomed to servitude. Perhaps more convincing than the economic advantages slavery brought, Southern culture began to accept the notion that slavery was a Christian institution that benefited whites and blacks alike. This acceptance of slavery as a biblically approved commitment was due to the Southern evangelical Christians, the majority religious group in the South that, through selective reading, found evidence to proclaim slavery acceptable. Slavery and the spread of plantation agriculture, along with the creation of a unique Southern racist culture, defined the South radically different from the North. As the argument against slavery began to spread throughout the nation, planters attempted to religiously counter anti-slavery arguments while struggling to defend outside intervention as well as internal white disloyalty.